All right, we will go ahead then and get started. We'll pick it up with chapter 3. Chapter 3, of course, is this image of gold that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. There was a requirement for worship, and we notice something right off the bat all of a sudden, and this is one chapter where Daniel is not to be found. And so this is the Bible commentary. We wonder why is it showing him as absent? And so here we have from the Bible reading program, pages 25 and 26, the PDF file that I sent to you. We have 6 possible reasons, and these come from the Expositor's Bible commentary. Number 1, he may have been absent from Babylon at the time, perhaps on government business. That's very feasible. He could have been out of town. He could have been somewhere in a province 100 miles away, and they traveled by land, and it was slow, so he wasn't there. Number 2, he may have been involved with the king's cabinet with various and sundry plans. Number 3, he might have been ill. We know from later in the book of Daniel, there were times when he said that he was sick certain days. And so he may have had an illness. Then number 4, it points out that he was the king's vizier or prime minister. And it may just have been that his role was so important that he was not required to make a public demonstration of loyalty to an image of this God. And let's see, number 5, it mentions 7 categories of public officials, but none of the wise men over whom Daniel had been made chief were included. So maybe he had an official sanction just not to be involved. And then the last one, point 6, perhaps Daniel's reputation as a diviner was so formidable that even the jealous Chaldeans did not dare attack him before the king. So as we look at this chapter, remember the position of the Chaldeans. We mentioned last time they were a priestly caste. Before Nebuchadnezzar, you had the king reigning from up in Nineveh, and the Chaldeans, the religious side, were in power down in Babylon. And then, of course, Nineveh was totally destroyed in 612 BC, and that led Nebuchadnezzar, when he came to the throne, to move his headquarters, and everything was down in Babylon. So from time to time, we see this friction between church and state. We see the monarch, and then we have the Chaldeans. And this story in chapter 3 is very likely an attempt of the Chaldeans to get control again, because they lost a lot of power with what happened in chapter 2 and how Daniel and friends were promoted so high above them. So let's go now and put my notes up on the screen. We'll come to those from time to time. But chapter 3, verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits, and its width 6 cubits. Now, if you factor in the fact that the Babylonian cubit was very close to 20 inches, the one used down in the Holy Land was closer to 18, this one was 20. We're looking at a height of 90 or 100 feet. It seems very much out of proportion of the height versus the width. Very likely, and again the Bible commentary points that out, very likely it was an image set high on a tower. So that could be an answer for that. So 60 cubits, 6 cubits, set up in the plain of Dura, province of Babylon. So verse 2, King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, administrators, governors, counselors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces. So there's actually 8 different categories as I counted them, to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And so all of these came. I'm going to skip parts of this just to try to keep it moving, but verse 4, a herald cried aloud, "To you it is commanded." All right, now let's pause right there. We'll comment on it a little later, but this is one of the times where we find this conflict between church and state, but also an attempt to bring about one world religion, and then a requirement to worship according to the way the state said that they were to worship. So to you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Now, these furnaces were all over Babylon. There were gigantic walls, we'll comment on a little bit later. Massive walls, and with that Mesopotamian area, their chief building material was the baking of bricks, which took these furnaces where the charcoal would heat it and bake it. So, verse 7, when the people heard all of that, they fell down and worshiped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Now we come to Daniel's 3 friends, beginning in verse 8. Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, or Mishael and Azariah. We know them better as by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But they, of course, did not fall down and worship. Now, last time at the end of the Bible study, we looked at some of the lessons that we can learn. We mentioned a couple of examples of living faith. Certainly, we have a tremendous example in this chapter where the men end up telling the king, our God is able to deliver us, but if he doesn't, we're still not going to bow down. So he could deliver them even in death. So anyhow, they spoke to king, okay, verse 8, therefore at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. So probably or possibly we have Daniel out of pocket. Daniel may be elsewhere in the empire. And they were afraid to go against Daniel. But here we have his friends, and they don't have Daniel there taking up for them. So they go after Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they tell the story, and in verse 12, there are certain Jews whom you have set. So this tells us that was really a sticking point with them. They had lost power, and they wanted power. They wanted it back. So you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. So, interesting scenario that's appearing here. And as the chapter unfolds, again, we have this attempt of religion taking back control. Let's continue on here. Again, I'll skim some of this. Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, had the 3 brought before him. He asks them in verse 14, is it true that you do not worship my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up. And the end of verse 16, verse 15, but if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who would deliver you from my hands? Well, throughout this story, he is going to be reminded that there is a God of gods. Nebuchadnezzar, in the previous chapter, had admitted that Daniel's God was a God of gods, that he was a Lord of kings, that he was a revealer of secrets. So progress is being made, but he still is not saying the God of Daniel, the God of these three, is the only true God. So, who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? He's about to find out. So they answered, and to me, verse 17 is one of the most exciting verses as far as living by faith that you'll find anywhere in the Bible. Verse 17, if that is the case, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. And of course, that has the result that we would expect with Nebuchadnezzar, having seen into his mind and character, and frankly his vanity. He was full of fury, and so he gives the command to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. So perhaps they had a means of, with some bellows, pumping more air in there to cause the charcoal that's burning to be even hotter. Verse 21, they are bound in their coats, trousers, turbans, and other garments, and were cast into the midst of the fiery furnace. Verse 22, because the king's command was urgent, says the flame of the fire killed the men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So the 3 friends of Daniel are thrown in. The men who throw them in are killed by the fire. These 3, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, fell down bound in the midst of the fiery furnace. Verse 24, then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, Did we not cast 3 men into the midst of the fire? Look, verse 25, he answered, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Now, realize that when the way it comes across in the New King James, it's like, he's finally, his eyes are open, and he's seeing that Daniel's God is the God, and that his son. But still, in the Hebrew, or actually this is a part that's still written in the Aramaic, it's more like an A. Some son of the gods is walking around with them. So verse 26, he went to the entrance. He called for them to come out. He called them the servants of the Most High God. Come out and come here. Again, so it seems like by baby steps, there is some impact that is being made on Nebuchadnezzar. But then we go to another chapter and we see that, well, maybe not that much progress. So they came out of the midst of the fire, and notice in the middle of verse 27, they saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power, the hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of the fire was not on them. So it was a remarkable miracle. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him and they have frustrated the king's word. Well, verse 29, I make a decree that any nation, people, or language who speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. The king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So, remarkable story, again, example of living faith, that regardless of what the government says, and in this case, an emperor of Babylon, regardless of what he said, these three friends of Daniel were not going to compromise. They drew the line. They would not cross over. If it cost them their life, they were ready to pay that price. But as we see, it was God's will. He delivered them. And anyhow, now let me go back to the handout. On point number one, I put this in here as something just for your information more so. 605 BC, the predecessor was Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabopolassar. Nebuchadnezzar was leading a campaign. The Babylonians were fighting against Egypt. His father died, and then he hurried back to Babylon to take the throne. You know, as we have our saying, possession is 9/10 of the law. You want to hurry back, take possession of the throne. You have the dates here of actually about 19 years of the conquest of the house of Judah. It went by phases. Daniel and friends were among the very earliest ones who were taken captive and taken to Babylon. You have Ezekiel and others who are probably a dozen years, don't hold me to that date, but about a dozen years later, they're making their move toward Babylon. And then you have the city of Jerusalem actually being overthrown, destroyed, closer to the end of that period, 586. But during these years, you had a rebellion of Ashkelon, one of the five main cities of the Philistines. You had, after the conquest of Judah, you had the siege on Tyre, which took quite a while. Tyre was that little island just off of the coast there, further up the Mediterranean. You have conquest of Egypt. You have then, well, we'll talk about the possible dates for his 7 years of insanity. It seems to make the most sense that that was late in his life, and then maybe a year later died. But those dates are just so you can have or will have. Now, two possibilities exist for the dating of his insanity, and that's what we're getting to here in chapter 4. This is based on the dream of the tree, the bending of the stump that would keep it from growing until an extended period of time later. Let me go ahead back over to the Bible reading program, or excuse me, back over. Tom Robinson was writing about this 8-year episode where you had a warning to Nebuchadnezzar, maybe a delay of a year, and then he walks out and sees this great city that I've built. And then followed by the 7 years of affliction or 7 years of insanity. Eusebius and Josephus, as historians, both suggest dates late in his reign. So probably, like I have here on the handout, very possibly the dates 570, 563 are a pretty good approximation. Okay, in chapter 4, we get to this banding of the stump. And then we'll talk about these 7 times a little bit later. But in chapter 4, Most of this chapter, a good part of this chapter, is written as the words of Nebuchadnezzar himself. So Daniel apparently is just as a scroll writing down, or is given a document of what Nebuchadnezzar actually said. Nebuchadnezzar the king, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell on the earth, peace be multiplied to you. Here he is at Babylon. It's interesting that Peter, in one of his epistles, mentions being at Babylon. He uses the exact same phrase, peace be multiplied to you, in that epistle. I thought it good to declare the signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, dominion from generation to generation. So in verse 4, he begins describing the fact that he has another dream. I tell you, when Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, they were doozies. They were amazing. And he was, verse 5, a dream made him afraid. The thoughts on my bed, visions in my head troubled me. So once again, it's kind of like, here we are years later, it would appear, and he's calling again for the same guys, the astrologers, magicians, Chaldeans, and soothsayers, and they can't give the answer. And so verse 8, but at last Daniel came before me. His name is Belteshazzar. We covered the names as the men were renamed. Daniel meaning God is judge. In him is the spirit of the holy God. I told the dream before him, saying, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know the Spirit of God is in you, and no secret troubles you. Explain to me the visions of my dream that I have seen and its interpretation. So he tells of this vision of a tree. Verse 10, a tree in the midst of the earth, its height was great. The tree grew and became strong. Its height reached to the heavens, and it could be seen to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were lovely, its fruit abundant. And in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it. The birds of the heavens dwelt in the branches, and all flesh was fed from it. Verse 13, I saw in the visions of my head, while on my bed there was a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven. There are places where God has the seven spirits. He has his eyes go throughout the whole creation. There are those who are his intelligence service, and so perhaps these are being referred to here. And he cried aloud, chop down the tree, cut off its branches, strip off its leaves, and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts get out from under it, the birds from its branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump and roots in the earth. Now, a lot of times you cut down a tree and it will come back. You will have life that'll spring from that area again. Leave the stump and roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze. In the tender grass of the field, let it be wet with the dew of heaven. And let him, notice him, we're not talking about a tree here only, him graze with the beasts on the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from that of a man. Again, his heart is changed. Let him be given the heart of a beast, and let 7 times pass over him. So many of you will remember that, pardon me, the church's teaching that goes back into the 1970s. Mr. Herbert Armstrong wrote for the longest time. He was seeing things about there is a spirit in man. There is the animal brain, but then there's this tremendous difference in the mind of a human being. And the difference is this non-physical element called in the Bible the spirit in man that gives the power of intellect, decision making and just distinguishes human beings from the animal world. And so it is as though what happened with Nebuchadnezzar as the story unfolds is as though God pulled that spirit in man from him, not the Holy Spirit, but the spirit in man, so that for 7 years, as it appears, 7 years, he was as a beast in the field. He did not have that spirit in man that gave him the power of human intellect. Let 7 times pass over him. This decision is by the decree of the watchers. The order that the living may know, the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets over them the lowest of men. Okay, so Nebuchadnezzar, have seen this. Now you, Belteshazzar, Daniel, declare its interpretation. Since all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known to me the interpretation, but you are able, for the Spirit of the Holy God is in you. So he obviously remembers something from the event years earlier where the interpretation of the great warrior, the 4 different parts of it were explained through Daniel. Of course, God working through him. So in verse 19, Daniel, it says, was astonished for a time. His thoughts troubled him. So the king spoke and said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its interpretation trouble you. Interesting here the way it is. That it's as though Nebuchadnezzar realized the meaning, the interpretation is going to be something awful that I don't want to hear. But he's encouraging Daniel, go ahead, spit it out, say it, tell me what's going on. Belteshazzar answered and said, my lord, may the dream concern those who hate you and its interpretation concern your image. So it was bad. And Daniel's saying, would to God it was applying to somebody else, one of your enemies. Verse 20, the tree that you saw, which grew and became strong, whose height reached the heavens and could be seen by all the earth. Again, let's skip part of this. Verse 22, it is you, O king. So kind of like the image in chapter 2 where he said, you are the head of gold. Here he's making a statement that this tree represented you, Nebuchadnezzar, and also Babylon as an empire. Your greatness has grown and reaches to the heavens, your dominion to the end of the earth. And mentions the Holy One, the decree, chop it down, destroy it, leave the stump and roots, bound with iron and bronze. Verse 24, this is the interpretation, O king. Verse 25, they shall drive you from men, your dwelling shall be among the beasts of the field. They shall make you eat grass like oxen. They shall wet you with the dew of heaven, and 7 times, there's that word again, shall pass over you till you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomsoever he chooses. And inasmuch as they gave the command to leave the stump and the roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be assured to you. So Nebuchadnezzar, you'll be gone 7 years, but you're going to come back and have that kingdom, although it was just a little short period of time afterward that he died. Verse 27, therefore, O king, let my advice be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by being righteous, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. Perhaps there will be a lengthening of your prosperity. So in this case, there is the option for time. And God gives warnings through his servants, the prophets. He lets them know what the end result is going to be. Nebuchadnezzar was given a warning, and he was given the admonition. You better change your ways. You better get right with God. And it lasted a year. And Nebuchadnezzar, as we pick it up in verse 28, all this came upon Nebuchadnezzar at the end of the 12 months. He was walking about the royal palace of Babylon. The king spoke, saying, "Is not this great Babylon that I have built for royal dwelling by my..." We've got a man here with an I problem. I, me, my. Always watch for those words. My mighty power and for the honor of my majesty. While the word was still in the king's mouth, a voice fell from heaven. King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you. And they shall drive you from men. Your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall eat the grass like oxen. 7 times shall pass over you until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he chooses. That very hour the word was fulfilled concerning Nebuchadnezzar. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hair had grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws. Well, at the end of the time. So we'll come back to this 7 times, but at the end of that period of time, again, the words here of Nebuchadnezzar, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven. My understanding returned to me. So it's like God put the spirit in man back with his mind, and he had the power of intellect again. My understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. His dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom is from generation to generation. The inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven. Among the inhabitants of the earth, no one can restrain his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my honor and splendor returned to me. And so counselors, nobles restored the kingdom. Majesty was added. Verse 37, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth and his ways justice. And those who walk in pride, he is able to put down. So God resists the pride, the proud, the arrogant, the haughty, and he lifts up those who walk with humility. Now let's look at our handout here, point 3, the banding of the stump, Babylon, and the 7 times. First bullet, there is a possible prophetic duality to Nebuchadnezzar's 7 years of insanity. Could these 7 years on Nebuchadnezzar also refer to the empire? Well, first of all, and I went ahead and put the text of the scriptures in the handout. It appears from scripture that it uses the word time to represent a year. Also, on occasion, the word is in the plural, times, that would represent years, and generally it's understood in the Hebrew as it's used later in Daniel that it's times 2. So a year, 2 years, and a half a year. We'll see that a little bit later. We come to this conclusion of a time representing a year by putting several scriptures together. Chapter 7 of Daniel, verse 25. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. All right, the thought is repeated in Daniel 12, verse 7. It shall be for a time, times, and half a time. And when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things shall be finished. Then, if we then go to Revelation, you see, I mentioned last time, Daniel is often called the Old Testament Apocalypse. Revelation is also known as the Apocalypse. This is where God reveals. In Revelation 12, verse 6, it's speaking here of the true church. Now, there's this other church, this other woman. I think in our booklet, Book of Revelation Unveiled, there's a chapter on the story of two women. You have the true church, you have the other church. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God that they should feed her there 1,260 days. I didn't put in here, there is a place where it talks about the beast power arising, and it would have 42 months. 42 months. 42 times your average of 30 days in a month. And you come up with the same figure, 1,260. A little later in Revelation 12, verse 14, the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. So here in chapter 12, verse 14, she flees, she's being protected, the wilderness, her place, and God protects her for a time, times, and half a time. Phrase we just read back in Daniel. But in verse 6, it says that's 1,260 days. So as you go on down the bullets, I threw some things in here, I hope just to help you with the calculations, to have the math there. If you're not interested in it, that's fine. Everybody is not. And by all means, the worst thing we can do is to try to work with prophecy like it's a jigsaw puzzle, and we've got a hammer in hand, and it's close, and it doesn't quite fit, and we want to pound it in there. Well, we don't want to do that with prophecy. We want to let God unveil, reveal, interpret for us in His due time. So 3.5 times, times, and half a time would appear to equal the same 42 months at the time of the end, or the same 1,260 days of the church being protected. Now, we also need to throw into the equation here the fact that there are times when in prophecy, in prophetic fulfillment, there is the day for a year principle. For instance, we've got Numbers 14, verse 34. That's where the spies went into the Holy Land, the Promised Land. They were there 40 days. Then, as Israel sinned, didn't believe the report, didn't want to fight the people who lived there, they were punished by spending 40, not days, but years in the wilderness until the older generation died. You have a similar principle there in the scripture in Ezekiel 4. Ezekiel laid on one side so many days, and then the other side so many days, and that was a day for a year as far as what Israel and then what Judah would go through. So, average year in the Old Testament, 360 days. That's not exact according to the lunisolar calendar, but we find that generalization used, for instance, in the story of the flood. It makes a statement that the waters were over the earth for 5 months, and then another place it mentions it was 150 days. Okay, this last part again, it's just there. I know the church has written about this and preached on it across many, many years, but we used to have much more of a prophetic focus. But at least you need to be aware of it. 360 average days in a year times 7, you come up with 2,520. If we apply the day for a year principle, Babylon fell. Babylon was cut down. Babylon was banded, so to speak, in October 539 BC. That is one date. It's amazing how many historians, archaeologists, they all come back and everybody agrees on the date, October 539, Babylon fell. And of course, the story of that is told in chapter 5. If we use that as our starting date and go forward 2,520 years, we're going to come to 1981 AD, which some of us remember. It's been a while now. Revelation 18:2, Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen. You had ancient Babylon that fell. There's this end time Babylon. It's going to fall a second time. So I just leave you with the question there at the bottom of the page. Do these 7 years also represent a time when the second and the final Babylon the Great that has been banded could then begin to arise? Babylon will rise again. We would know it better as a European superpower that would arise. Through the 80s and 90s, a lot of things happened as far as the breakup of the Iron Curtain, various countries able to flee from the old USSR and have a degree of freedom. The numbers of members of the European Union went from 6 to 10 to, 27-ish now. There are so many, we wonder, well, how does it get pared down to 10? But anyhow, I just throw that out there for whatever it's worth. Everyone is not interested in it, and that's fine. But I think we need to at least have a bit of an exposure to that. Okay, we can get started on chapter 5. We should be basically familiar with this. We have sometime later, this is going to end up being the last king of Babylon. This Belshazzar was a co-regent, reigning with, and I'm drawing a blank, I don't have it written right down here in front of me. But he's going to die that night when this story ends. Nabonidus was the king. Belshazzar was the co-regent. The focus of his reign was there in Babylon. But I thought I mentioned here just a little of the city of Babylon, and I've got some slides I want to show you. Some reports say that the ruins were found to be square, others rectangular. They were massive, though, 55 miles in the circumference around the ancient city walls of Babylon. Herodotus, the Greek historian, was prone to exaggerate. He wrote in one place in the Persian Wars that the walls were over 200 feet in height. Now, that's proven by archaeology to be a tremendous exaggeration. They find the walls to be closer to 90 feet. But you know, in that flat plain area of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, if you're a soldier with an army that's marching across the plains and you see something in the distance and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and it covers the whole horizon in front of you, that is a sizable a problem if you're among the army that has to go besiege that place. There were regular watchtowers. It was said that the top of the outer wall was so wide that 2 chariots could travel down it side by side. Gates were constructed of heavy cedar, but then covered in strips of bronze. Now I'm going to show you a picture in just a minute of the Ishtar Gate. It's on display in the Pergamum Museum in Berlin. You see, the German archaeologists were the first ones to actually go there and lead the archaeological effort. And like the other powers, you know, if you want to see a lot of the artifacts from the old world, you go to the Louvre Museum in Paris, you go to the British Museum, or you go to a place like the Pergamum Museum in Berlin. And they have brought back so much that is there on display. Anyhow, let me go to the slides that I have. And let's see here. There's a map over here to the left center. We have Jerusalem and the lands of Israel and Judah. But over here with the Euphrates and Tigris Valley, upstream on the Tigris, you have Nineveh. Again, was destroyed 612 BC. And then here we have Babylon over on the Euphrates. In fact, the Euphrates River goes through the city with huge walls on either side. And that was a part of the means by which the Medes and the Persians gained access. All right, Mom Denise came and told me that it's not showing on the screen.
We can see it now.
Okay, thank you. All right, let me go back up here. All right, there's the map. Basic area of modern Iraq and then Iran over to the right-hand side. But Babylon is right there on the Euphrates River. Here is a sketch, and pardon me, but I picked this up somewhere, and I don't have the reference. Let me make that bigger. Okay, here is the Ishtar Gate, the processional way coming into the city. The victorious armies of Babylon would bring the conquered, possibly King Zedekiah. Other Jewish officials may have come right through there, be led in, the conquered before the conquerors. Here we have Nebuchadnezzar's palace. We have a tower. We have a temple for Marduk. And you see the river Euphrates goes through the middle of the city. Large, tall walls on either side. Okay, the Ishtar Gate has been taken to Berlin. The tile work is absolutely a marvel. Various types of animals. These trees appear to be of kind of a palm, maybe date palm type tree. You have these lions on either side. So they, in the Pergamum Museum, they've set it up as they found it and took it apart in the ruins of Babylon. There's more of a close-up of the lions. They also have a model, and down on the bottom here you have these lions, and that's the gate. Notice the height of the walls, the watchtowers for all of the guards. Quite a fortified city. Oops, wrong way. Okay, I'm going to back out of that now. All right, let's go back to chapter 5. Sorry, that kind of threw me a little bit there with the technology. Yeah, I guess we just, like Mr. Rigord did, and Denise came up to the office, but if for some reason there's something I think I'm projecting and you're not seeing it, just unmute and let me know. That's the fastest way, and we'll we'll hopefully get it covered that way. Okay, in chapter 5, we have here Belshazzar. Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. Okay, the problem comes in verse 2. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father, now, the Hebrew word, this is actually an Aramaic word here, it generally means more so of an ancestor, because it's thought that Belshazzar was a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. So he gives the command, bring those that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem. The king and his lords, his wives, and concubines might drink from them. So, verse 4, they drank wine and praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, wood, and stone. And then he has a problem. The same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall. The king saw the part of the hand that wrote. The king's countenance changed, his thoughts troubled him, so that the thoughts of the joints of his hips were loosened, his knees knocked against each other. So he was beyond being troubled. He was in a horrible shape here. So once again he calls for the astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers, and promises great glory, great wealth for whoever can give the meaning. Verse 9, Belshazzar was greatly troubled, his countenance was changed, his lords were astonished. But it's interesting here in verse 10, this is a long time later, after, it was what, the second year of Nebuchadnezzar, when the story of chapter 2 took place, and Daniel finally came and gave God's interpretation of what that great warrior pictured, the 4 different parts, the stone cut without hands. This is a long time later, because Nebuchadnezzar had over 40 years of reigning. And now we're into another king. But this queen, and it's thought this may have been the queen mother, may have been Nicatrus, I believe it was Nicatrus, who had been possibly even married to Nebuchadnezzar or to the son. But she remembered. And notice what she says here. The queen spoke, saying, King, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the Spirit of the Holy God. Again, don't read too much into that. She is saying there is someone who really has some help from the spirit side of life. And anyhow, in the days of your father, again, probably grandfather, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. So she names him as this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. So we're right at our hour limit. I'd like to keep it to that because it is a weeknight. So I think that's as logical a place to pause as possible. But the slides that I showed, I hope gave you a little taste of the marvels and the glory of ancient Babylon. What archaeologists have found is just astounding. The size of the walls, you would look at it and think it is impossible to overrule it. And yet we'll look more at the story next time as far as what happened and how in that same night Cyrus and the armies of the Medes Medes and the Persians came in. They actually diverted the river. They walked in the riverbeds. They had spies inside who opened some doors, and they walked into the city in the midst of a drunken orgy. And you know the rest of the story. Belshazzar was killed. So, some of the lessons, the end of page 2. History records that human systems of government often attempt to bring about one world religion with forced compliance. So we saw it in chapter 3. We will yet see it in chapter 6, which led to Daniel spending the night with the lions. We have other statements later in Daniel. We know at the time of the end there will be this attempt to bring the Christian world together. It has happened before, it'll happen again. The attempt to enforce Sunday worship. Anyhow, the last part, the sovereignty of God. Nebuchadnezzar was humbled. Belshazzar is about to be brought down. Daniel had great favor with Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, and we're going to find that he has great favor with the Medo-Persians because God had him there as his tool. So anyhow, we will go ahead and end that. Let me go ahead and unmute all.